Start the morning right with a cup of Vinyl Tap. Nothing beats the refreshing taste of a hot, warm mug of Vinyl Tap. Enjoy your podcast in liquid form today. Vinyl Tap. Enjoy responsibly.
2, 1.
Vinyl Tap.
I'm
Baby
Tim,
Jason.
and we just listened to 3 Prog albums over the course of this month. Boy, Prog, what a can of beans that is. So let's open up the can and talk about the beans that we listened to.
Some of those beans were really good, and none of those beans tasted bad, in my opinion.
I think they were all good beans.
It's hard to
think they're all-
find bad beans.
We've had a very successful month here on Vinyl Tap. I didn't hate any of it.
Which is good.
is
Although,
really
from memory, you were a bit underwhelmed by one of them.
Well, you hyped up Carnival quite a bit. It's not Carnival's fault.
Right,
It's
okay.
ours.
It's a really good album.
So I guess that more just stands testament to anybody who hypes up an album to you. You shouldn't listen to them because they're probably full of shit.
Oh, yeah.
So
On
let
an
that be a
unrelated
lesson
note-
to you, Jason.
In the Court of the Crimson King is the best album I've ever heard, and it will be the best album you've ever heard. So get your expectations high.
No, I disagree.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
like it's pretty great, but
It's not the best album I've heard. It's very important. It's super duper important.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Actually, on that point, I didn't do any research on how important it is, and I was kind of hoping that maybe you did. Can
just
we?
throwing this at us.
I certainly am. I forgot
Well,
to mention
this-
this earlier, so we could be a bit prepared. But do you have any? Do you know of bands that are like these guys are the shit?
Off the top of my head, no. But I know that what they did is a super important album that kind of started the whole like blending genres in the way that prog does.
Right. Okay.
Right, so it's a big question about the history of prog and what the fuck prog means. Because, like, we all have this general vague idea when we say prog, right? But it's difficult to, especially in the way it's used today, actually nail down what the hell we're talking about. When I listen to Carnival's Sound Awake, it drills into this pre-existing notion of prog. I feel that it like has all of these fusion elements that it steers into, but prog by definition should be continually evolving, incorporating more shit at every opportunity. Not to say that it should be so dense with information and different ideas that it's incomprehensible, but it should be something that you can't point at and say this is what prog sounds like exactly, you know?
This is where you get into the distinction between like progressive music and progressive rock or
Yeah.
progressive metal.
Right.
Because when you say prog, I think most people kind of associate that with progressive rock, progressive metal, like the typical things you think of.
I think that I got trapped by that, didn't I? I
think
think
so.
it was during Court of the Crimson King. Actually, was
Yeah.
Yeah,
Whereas you could have like a jazz band that decides they're going to incorporate some, I don't know, some screamo into it just because they want to experiment and it works for them. And that would, without a doubt, be progressive music.
Even though it would generally be characterized as some kind of fusion, but those are basically the same thing, you know? It's a certain genre that's incorporating elements from other genres
but is
in
it
a way
though?
that's
Because-
experimental and
because there is a distinction between, when someone says fusion jazz, there is that distinction. Like, jazz is taking elements of Latin or rock or whatever and incorporating that into it, but that's not necessarily considered progressive rock, prog.
But it is progressive music, and that's the like point we're making. Prog,
But-
as in like progressive
But like
music.
progressive in the sense of it's like literally progressing music, or progressive in the sense that it's constantly developing. I mean,
think-
like
Are those two things not like a big old Venn diagram?
Progressive might be a dangerous word to have used when this stuff was first being described. I think maybe experimental, but that also has connotations that aren't necessarily applicable, because progressive like has this idea of moving forwards, right? This is the way, this is the direction, the evolution. And I don't think that's what progressive music should be about. I think it's just about trying shit out. But experimental
Right.
has other like crazier connotations, right?
Right. So, okay, so at some point then, the idea that like progressive music has kind of ended up as like a, I don't know, the sound of Rush, right? Like they, could you say that the moment that Rush happened, prog became sort of
Like a defined genre, a
a
defined,
defined
canon
genre
of
by
sounds.
their sound. You know, did suddenly vibraphone, as exampled by these three albums, become a staple point?
When did that happen?
Yeah, I think that at best genres are useful guides, and at worst they're wildly misleading terms with connotations. Because things can be multiple things and fit into different things, but as soon as you try and like pin it down as specifically this, or specifically that, you run into issues of, well, what about this element or what about that element, especially with something like what we've been listening to that blends so many different styles together.
So if we're steering into it, the history of like using progressive as a term to describe popular music began with, I think it was big band, where arrangers would incorporate elements from fucking Stravinsky into their music, and that's cool. And it was like it's experimental, like by definition, because have you heard Stravinsky?
Right.
So this it is weird how the term has come from this. We're incorporating stuff from wildly different art music into art music, right? Into now the word means Rush and what Rush sounds like, and Yes, and Pink Floyd sometimes, but not always, and the Moody Blues, but forget about the rest of
Forget
it.
about that,
You know,
yeah.
it's just, it's a mess. It's a messy term, and that's pretty much what all genres are when you think about them the way that we're thinking about them, right? When you analytically dive into them, they just break. That's what genres do. It's you hold it too tight and it fucking crumbles in your hand.
So
If we're going to use these three albums as our test bed, I think the Thank You Scientist and Carnival glue together better as a cohesive, you know, prog genre,
you're
just within
ignoring
themselves.
the context of about 50 years, though. by
He's not
saying
ignoring it. He's just
No.
he's skimming over it for now. He's
Yeah,
getting
and-
to it, I imagine.
And I think that's sort of but I guess I don't know, maybe when Thank You Scientist and Carnival, I don't know, would they define themselves as prog? Do they define themselves as prog?
I have openly heard Thank You Scientists refer to themselves as prog. Carnival, I haven't heard them use that term, but I know that they spoke about how their sound changed and shifted on Sound Awake versus Themata.
Right.
And I think my inkling would be that they would be willing to say that they're progressive, but
I wonder though if Thank You Scientist and Carnival would say that they sound at all similar to
King Crimson.
King Crimson. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think that's such a really interesting point how just with our little three albums there's almost a shift in the genre name itself.
Absolutely.
From something where
Yeah.
it's quite sort of experimental, pushing the boundaries, and not to say that the other two albums weren't doing that, but they kind of they're doing it within the genre form.
Yeah.
Within that kind
Whereas-
of there's a particular
The
sound.
Court of the Crimson
and-
King is like monumentally experimental.
Yeah.
my not like counter argument, but not like agreeance point either. Like my response, I guess, to that is look at where jazz was in the 20s with all, and the 30s, like a lot of the swing, and compare that to where jazz got to in the 80s with fusion, like it's still theoretically the same genre and there are identifiable features across them, but they're exploring it and being experimental in different ways.
I would disagree with that. I think, like, I mean, jazz sort of big band stuff, particularly, like, let's take big band as an example.
So
Like
Dizzy
the
and
stuff-
Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington.
Right, yeah, like that stuff is, I think, I don't know, like, Count Basie's big band wouldn't be defined as the same genre as, like, the swinging 30s big band and everyone's in their suits doing whatever you dance
If you're
in the
going to get
30s,
into like subgenres, sure, but are you going to sit there and tell me that they're both not jazz?
I'm not ready for this discussion. That's a deep
Because
deep talk.
when you say prog, that's not getting into specifics. That's the big, broad, overarching
Right,
equivalent
okay.
of jazz.
Okay.
Is how I view it.
Are the Beatles prog?
Find out next time on Vinyls.
No,
Okay.
seriously. Like they incorporate these Asian ideas into their music towards the end of the band's career, and they apply it to this. Like previously, they were a fucking boy band, right? And prog came from this term progressive pop. That was the first time it was used. And that was to describe, because this music was popular at the time. Rock and pop were the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So fucking, like, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and then King Crimson comes along and does this, and it's so wildly out there that we have to recategorize things. And it's just so interesting to me, the history of where these terms arise, because they didn't need to do that. You know, they could have just, like, said, there's this weird album and we'll just ignore it, and then... But then it was so, like, people loved the sound of it so much and wanted to do more crazy things, and you get, you know, Dark Side of the Moon, the Moody Blues had another career that just went elsewhere. And these other terms, acid rock, psych rock, stoner metal, it all, like, comes... It's a huge web that makes no sense.
Right, that's really interesting. I mean, I get, like...
It's hard to tell when you've even gone off track, because the track is just... it's a web.
I mean, yeah. Well, it's an interesting argument. I mean, King Crimson's like really pushing the fold with, like, I think in 21st Century Schizoid Man, they did something really cool with the vocals there, and I'm pretty sure that's. Do you guys know exactly what was going on there? I think we
Jason,
briefly
did
touched
you
on
look
that.
into this?
They pretty much, from what I could find out, like on the actual console itself, like just cranked the gain up on it to get the distorted kind of effect. I don't really know how to talk about it, but basically they just like turned it up all the way they could on the console to like, I guess, digitally distort it, maybe.
So it's constantly peaking.
Set the gain to maximum.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's what they did based on what I could find. At least that's what can't remember who, but one of the band members said is what they did when they were recording it. Because again, I think that song took one take based on what they said as well.
Right. So
yeah.
they were they're pushing the boundaries of what was kind of established. They're doing. I mean, I don't know. Is that sort of thing? Was that happening?
Back then, there wasn't really this set in stone way that you record things, right? That's what the Beatles was all about. They codified most of that stuff, right? Most of the like, it's come a long way since then, but a lot of the basic ideas came from their music, and people were still trying stuff out, right? It wasn't like, oh, this is the one way you record everything, which it is nowadays. Although there's a lot of variation we can do. Yes, Jason.
No, that's a good point, though. I mean, even though there are a lot of ways to record, in a way, you could make that argument that the door is set because, I mean, it's made for you now. It's all digitally, like you have to interact with a digital interface, and that's been programmed and set. And like it might be close to limitless, but oh yeah, whatever. You and your country arguments.
But so if you really wanted to, for whatever reason, I don't know what reason you would have, you can still go and record on tape. You can still use 8 tracks. They're still a thing. Studios still have the technology sitting around, even though it's not used that often. Again, I don't know why, but I know that some bands have done it. I think the Foo Fighters maybe did an album on tape. There's some band that I know of.
And you can too for the low price of
a lot of money.
$200,000.
It's,
Oh wow, really?
I don't fucking
I don't know.
making
It's a
stuff
lot.
up, but
It's
probably.
more expensive than going into a studio and using, the modern
Because
technology.
hard drives cost a lot less than tape.
Yes, and you can do a lot more takes. It's not as permanent or pressure sensitive in terms of you have to get it right this time, otherwise you've ruined the whole day's work.
You can leave a tape out in the sun though and get some really cool not digital, analog distortion effects. It's pretty.
Yeah, there are
wild.
physical effects that you can't do on you can replicate, you can try to emulate them in a digital space, but it's just not going to be the same. So we were talking about this off camera after the last one, the I'm sitting in a room thing, where the guy just plays the tape back into a room and records all the artifacts that come about from just audio in a space. Right, you can do that. You can try to emulate that digitally by compressing it and re-importing it, but it's not the same, right? It doesn't actually capture a real place, which is the entire point of it, and that's just it's cool. And the whole digital versus analog paradigm kind of illustrates how impressive in the Court of the Crimson King is. Compositionally, the other two albums we listened to are extremely tight and they have so much stuff going on and it's so dense with amazing ideas. But they have the luxury of being able to record, of multi-track and...
Right.
Yeah.
On the note of you talking about how tight they are composition-wise, Carnival and doing Change and Change Part 2...
Right. You can re-record a track from a previous album if that's what that was.
So they had pretty much... There's a few things. They were running out of time in terms of their pre-production for Themata. When they
that's
were
their
writing...
first album for everyone.
That's their first album. In terms of when they were writing it, they said that it felt more in line with the things they were writing for Sound Awake.
So they were writing for both albums at the same time?
No, I think they'd finished writing pretty much everything for Themata. But Change was kind of a mid
Right,
gap
so
kind
it's
of thing.
this doesn't sound like this album.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, the version that we hear on Sound Awake for Change Part 1 is drastically different to, not the melodies there and the general build-up at the end into Change Part 2 is the same, but there's no vibraphone. It's more ambient guitar
Well, then it's not
sounds
prog.
and stuff.
If there's no vibraphone.
They definitely sound more prog on Sound Awake than they do on their first album.
Right. What do they sound like in their first album, would you say?
More of just
Just generic metal? Not generic in a disparaging
but
way.
more... Yeah, I don't think they had found their sound as much, which I think is... my personal take is that's pretty typical of prog bands, that they kind of...
They have a starting point and then they incorporate new elements.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is to do with the drummer, Steve Judd, because he wasn't on their first album. And I think it was Drew Goddard, or was it the other guitarist? It was Drew Goddard who did all the drums on the first one. And they're very solid drumming, but they're a lot more metal drums and not as intricate or as technical as what you get on Sound Awake, which drastically affects the sound. Because I think if you were to put those sorts of drums on the first album, you really change the sound.
Was he even part of the band when they were recording Themata?
I think they came across him either during the process or just after the process.
He wasn't on the album.
He wasn't on the album though.
Right. So
So
they
Sound
just
Awake
didn't
was his first album with them.
Right, so the band just didn't have a drummer, and then they released a whole
They
album.
had a drummer that they'd done their earlier EPs with and toured and played with, I think, but he left or they got rid of him. I don't really know. Before, they parted ways in some way, and then they did the album and got Drew to do the drums. But I also think that like Drew probably had a pretty solid idea of what he wanted, because I think he personally wrote all the songs on the first album.
Right. Okay. Yep. Yep. Well, I mean, in terms of who won this this season, just getting sort of right to it. Now that you've blown my mind with what is prog and what's not, I don't really feel like Thank You Scientist or Carnival really cut it anymore. Because how do they push the boundaries in any
I did it.
I was going to say, it is very hard to
world-shattering
beat
way?
Yeah.
something like King Crimson.
King Crimson might be the proggiest album.
Yeah.
Like, possible. Maybe. I'd
You-
have to
I
look
was gonna
more into
say,
that.
You say that, but that's a pretty bold
I said
statement.
might. Come on. What else do I have to do?
In terms of enjoyment, though, I wouldn't actually vote them as the highest. I think as like a sit down, I'm just going to listen and enjoy and not like be confronted with having the musical boundaries pushed 50 years ago. Or I don't know. Thank You Scientist, that first listen was really cool. That was such a mind-bending use of instruments and just, I don't know, really tight instrumentation and just musicality. The more I listened to it, the less the shininess was there, but as a first listen experience, that was dope. That was amazing.
Have you listened to other things they've done, or just that album
No,
still?
I have stubbornly
Right.
refused to.
Right, because I was interested to hear if... have you listened to it all, Tim?
I've listened to a little bit, but mainly because you listen to them.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's hard to
interested-
avoid when you're sitting right there.
Yes. Interested to see what you thought of like how their sound kind of developed a bit, but I guess that's a conversation for another time. I still think that I probably prefer Carnival to Thank You Scientist, which is, I guess, somewhat backwards because you picked it, but I picked Thank You Scientist like somewhat betting on the fact that you were going to pick Carnival.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because I knew how much you liked the album as well.
And look, to be perfectly honest, I feel like the only prog I actually know is, Carnival and Rush.
Yeah.
Right.
Although I think if I loosen my definition, I probably could have picked some pretty out there prog stuff, but
Like, maybe even Chick Corea could be counted as prog. I don't know. Prog's fucking whatever. Taylor Swift is prog.
Sure.
Do I get to vote now?
Yeah, of course. No votes
so
for
after
Teal.
that Taylor Swift comment,
Voting revoked.
Well, if I am allowed to speak once more, I would say that Thank You Scientist probably as an album is the most enjoyable to like experience for me. I think like it's got such a delicious melting pot of sounds that it's very intricately woven, and it's just it's nice to listen to. Whereas in the Court of the Crimson King was very confronting, but as a moment in musical history, it's unparalleled. When we're talking about this genre, I would say. So it's very tough for me to vote. I enjoyed listening to Sound Awake. I really sound like I'm not giving Sound Awake any credit. I am. It's good. It's really good. But I think I would vote for Thank You Scientist as an album, The Perils of Time Travel as an album. But if we're talking beyond a musical experience, I think Court of the Crimson King takes any cake you could present these three albums. It'll grasp it with its big old hands and eat the whole thing in one go.
I mean, with the album artwork with that huge open
Oh boy!
maw.
Oh, that's something we should talk
Yeah.
about, isn't it? What a segue! What a genius!
All of the artwork has been very fun to have up on the...
Maybe that's what prog is. Prog is
Good
album art. That's what makes you a prog band.
Yeah, the images for all of these three they're gorgeous.
Dope.
Look, I think I will change my vote purely based off artwork. Court of the Crimson King. That album.
So good.
There we go. That's a winner.
I think we would have ended up saying, because we all gave it a special mention, it was the front runner regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I win. I've won this month of Vinyl Tap. We need to keep track of this.
Click above to find out what else we've spoken about in this theme.
Click below to support the artist that we just listened to.
And make sure to tune in next week for more Vinyl Tap.
That's pretty good.